Well, good evening to everyone who is in the UK and Europe, and good morning to everyone who is across the other side of the Atlantic and whatever time of night it may be elsewhere around the world. And welcome to a conversation with Reid Hoffman, who most importantly is an alumnus of Wolfson College, but also happens to have had a certain amount of success with LinkedIn and other aspects of his career. So Reid, where are you at the moment? What kind of thing can you see outside of your window, as it were?
Well, I'm on the Washington coast, Washington State, so Pacific Northwest, and it is glorious trees and water, and we may occasionally hear the passing boat or prop plane.
Well, fantastic. Well, I'm looking out onto the lawn at Wolfson. And actually, the lawn has been turned into a beer garden. So we've got lots of students, some of them pretending to work, but most of them just drinking beer and looking out at the river. So, well, thank you very much for joining us, Reid. And this really is going to be a sort of a chat about a bit about your life and how you've arrived where you are, and also a look at the future and the future of work and the future of technology and wherever else we want to delve. And anyone who's watching on the YouTube channel, if anything that we say prompts you with a question, with a thought, please do just enter it on the chat of the YouTube channel, and I can see it. And at the end, there'll be a chance to ask Reid any of the questions you have. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. So Reid, it's lovely to talk to you, and in a way, it's quite nice that this happens to be the day when the US President, Joe Biden, is in the UK for the G7 summit and is having the pleasure, hopefully, of meeting all the other G7 leaders. But I wonder if I can just start by taking you back to your childhood. So you're brought up in Palo Alto, and you're part of that extraordinary environment. For someone like me looking at the 70s, it's where the future was being made. So what kind of person were you, and what formed you in those early days?
Well, the kind of person I think I was as a child was that kind of classic, somewhat nerdy geek with kind of my own interests. I was deeply ensconced in fantasy role-playing games because it allowed both the imagination of things that were very different, but also a structured environment by which you could play with your friends. I played a lot of board games because it was a way of kind of exercising the mind in various ways. And as it turned out, it was a kind of very interesting prep for many of the things that I would later do, because that kind of game playing is actually, in fact, really core to strategy. And I actually, recently did a post on the Greylock blog on this, just because it was kind of like, people think, oh, MBA is how I learned business strategy. And it's like, well, actually, in fact, I don't think MBAs actually learn business strategy as well as kind of the game dynamics and game playing usually ends up. And actually, in fact, I was recently talking to a close friend of mine from the UK, a guy named Rory Stewart, a former minister there.
Yeah, great.
He's teaching a class at Yale on grand strategy. And my recommendation to him was to actually, in fact, have all the kind of the class participants play some Avalon Hill board game, probably Tactics 2, and then write a paper about it, about what it meant about strategy as a way of understanding as a lens into strategy. And so that was the kind of thing I was doing a lot.
And can I just ask, Reid, prompted by that, were these games where you won, somebody won and somebody lost, or were they the kind of games that built civilizations? Because people talk about US board games being primarily about monopoly and winning, whereas particularly German board games being about creation. But where on that spectrum do they sit?
So the games that I played as a child were all in the US. There is a winner, basically. And I think, by the way, some mix of those is good too. Now, I've also in my later years become a huge fan of the German board game. It's well known, at least among Silicon Valley circles, that I'm a proponent of Settlers of Catan as the most entrepreneurial of board games, because you have trade. And so, as a matter of fact, what I would love is an evolution of Settlers, because Settlers also has one winner, but I would love an evolution of Settlers that allowed that cooperation. Because I actually think cooperative games are also very interesting. And so you have competition, you have cooperation, then coopetition, all of which I think are interesting and useful life skills. And part of the reason why, the fact that zero sum, there's only one winner, is actually antithetical to what entrepreneurship is about, which is actually, in fact, many new industries can be created, many new, kind of growth and success in work, in the workplace, is actually one of the reasons why I've become such a advocate of entrepreneurship.
You went into business. I mean, I think I read that at 12 you were an advisor of some kind. So you were the business aspects as well as the games. It was all one.
Yeah, and actually that was more like business stuff. My real focus on how business worked came much later. It just so happened to be that I was so because kind of that nerdy geek focus. I was so like into fantasy role-playing games that I worked my way into a local office of a game company called the Chaosium, which was doing a game called RuneQuest, which actually, in fact, had a restart on Kickstarter, and actually, in fact, the Borderlands, kind of scenario pack, which I worked on, has a little like byline credit for me, because that was actually one of the things I was working on when I was 12. But I was working on it not so much because I was being paid. Of course, always appreciate being paid, but because that was my focus of, the thing I would think about first when I woke up in the morning was, how could one make these fantasy role-playing games better, more human, more interesting, more involving? How would we create narrative together? That kind of thing. And that was the geeky 12-year-old.
So sort of, how to tell a story, which in some ways
Yes.
is the heart of strategy, isn't it? And did
Yes.
you have a community of other people who were gaming with you, that you built that network? Yeah.
Yeah, always. Most fantasy role-playing games, it's an interesting way, and some of my friends are doing them. Have had a little bit of a revival. I now know of a couple of D&D, Dungeons and Dragons games that are going on, and it's kind of a way to spend some deliberate cooperation, creative time together. So you're actually creating together as you're doing it, and that's, I think, one of the good aspects of that form of gaming.
So you then at sort of at school, high school, you were doing well academically, and you went into Stanford. And what was your major in Stanford? I should know, but what sort of?
Well, actually, it's only at Stanford. It's this thing called symbolic systems. Right. And the way that I got myself to it is my freshman advisor, a gentleman by the name of John Ryder, gave me an excellent piece of advice, which is, go through the Stanford, to select the major, go through the Stanford courses and degrees book and circle every course you need to take before you graduate. Now, as intellectually curious, you'll find yourself having circled courses that will take you 10 years. And so you won't be able to take all of them. But then look at the common theme. And what I found the common theme was that I was very curious about how we communicated, how language worked, how we thought, how we got to reasoning, how we understood the world. And so symbolic systems was this unique Stanford major, which said, well, actually, in fact, what language is a symbolic system. A thesis on at least thinking is the ability to create and participate in symbolic systems, whether or not it's instantiated in symbolic systems, the way that certain kinds of computer programs are, is an active thesis in TBD. And that was a tool that went across everything from philosophy to linguistics to computer science. And so look at symbol systems as a form of artificial intelligence, a form of cognitive science, and do that. And I was the 8th person, I think, to declare that major.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'd love to learn more about it. We haven't got time, but I'd love to know a bit more about that, because I can see from the outside, it's a phrase that, certainly in the UK we don't know. But yes, as you describe it, I can see all the reasons why it connects to so many things that are fascinating.
Exactly.
And again, as you were in Stanford, and there, from this side of the pond, everything seemed to come from California. Everything new seemed to come from California. Did it feel as though you were busy creating the future in Stanford and in that area, or were you just caught up in whatever it was that was your focus at the time?
Well, I think Stanford was the fortunate luck for me of going to Stanford is because it was embedded in the Valley. I got a lot of exposure to what was being created. And one of the things I did as an undergraduate is I also created this institution that exists today, which is called the Symbolic Systems Forum, which was a way of bringing, folks from Xerox PARC and SRI and startup companies and other things in to talk about the way you're doing, because part of what many of us, myself included, were interested in symbolic systems because we're interested in building things, we're interested in creating things. And we had this multidisciplinary approach to it. And part of it was like, okay, what does this mean for technologies that are being built, for companies that are being built? And so, actually, speaking of Friday afternoons, it was every Friday afternoon at 3:30. So it wasn't quite the end of the workday, but it was kind of because afterwards, a group of students and I would go with for beers with whoever had come in and lectured with us if they had the time and they were up for it, and they would get the pleasure of talking to students, and we get the pleasure of going, so you take this stuff that we're working on, and what do you do with it? Right? Like what are you building? And that kind of thing, and some academics as well, and other kinds of things. But it was a constructive, a building a kind of approach to it, and that was, I think, one of the things that let me my first lens into what was happening in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, fascinating. And then you came to Oxford, and of course, sitting in Oxford, it seems an entirely natural thing that somebody would want to come and study philosophy at Oxford. But was it obvious? Did everyone around you say, "Yep, that's a great thing to do"?
Not necessarily. It was driven by the academic. Like, I was thinking about whether or not I was going to become an academic.
Yeah.
And what I concluded was that while we were trying to build and model and understand thinking systems, the fundamental substrate of understanding how thinking systems were constructed was that we didn't have the concepts for. And in particular, one of the things that I had started focusing on in my last year was this notion of concepts, and also this notion of, well, how are concepts constructed? What is the notion of, what are the kinds of entities that have concepts that can formulate them in thinking and in language, and how, what's the tie between language and concepts and so on? And then, is there some notion of concepts being constructed? And that struck me as a philosophical question, which a number of philosophers, including at Oxford, were doing. And I said, okay, whether or not, maybe that's the lens of decision of whether or not I should go into academia or not.
Yeah.
And so it was like, all right, I'll go to Oxford and I'll try to get some sense of that.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm personally very interested because my son is doing exactly what you did on studying philosophy at Oxford at that stage. And but he's also been in the business world and government, and he's also facing exactly the same issues you're describing, which is he loves the idea of thinking clearly and finding the ideas and the concepts behind things, but he's also really interested in turning that into something. And I guess the challenge in an Oxford setting is we're brilliant at ideas, but then what do you do with those ideas? And I guess that would, when you came to think about the end of Oxford, that was a key thing in your mind, was what do you do with these concepts?
Yeah, and actually, in particular, what I realized was that there is, one of my favorite expressions is, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. And of course, the sotto voce is, in practice, there is. And so what I realized was actually, in fact, in philosophy, there's this theory of content called externalism, which is some of the semantics of the meaning and the reference of the world, the reference of words and the symbol systems to some degree embedded in the environment or theories of the environment, and so naturally evolves in that way. And what I ultimately concluded was that what I cared a lot more about, I really cared about the crisp thinking, the application of those theories, but the actual development of them, the substance of even the theory, had to be worked in what you're actually, in fact, doing in the world. And that actually, in fact, you learn from things. And for example, one of the things that I came to realize by going, and building technologies and building companies, is that even our mental view of, what kinds of theories we construct depend on what our technological tools are, right? So for example, if you look at the history of thinking about thought, it's well, when we were really focused on fluid mechanics, it was the brain is fluids, moving fluids around. Now we're working on computers, the brain is, a symbol system and moving stuff around. And you're well, actually, in fact, that evolution and development of technology actually also informs the theory, actually also informs the concepts. And so I got, okay, that's where I don't want to give up the thinking and the crispness and the value of that, but I want to do it in a way seeking scale and embedded in actual, construction and activity.
And can I just ask, because there will be people watching this who are at precisely that moment in their lives where they are studying here, loving Oxford, having to think about what the rest of their lives are going to be. They've got an academic path that may be open to them. They've got other paths. I mean, clearly you made the right decision for you, but any sort of thoughts as how they should be turning those things over in their head themselves?
Maybe three thoughts. So one is, very rarely are we as human beings, kind of fortunate enough to have a perfect fit. So usually there's imperfect fits. So like, for example, one of the things I miss about going into the business world is lengthy, kind of interesting intellectual discussions where you have as a breadth of an environment such as Oxford or, kind of other places. I kind of miss the fact that, a lot of businesses, once you formulate the idea, a lot of it's execution, and there's not a lot of you're not refining the details of the theory, a grand theory of the world, a sapiens, a guns, germs, and steel, etc. You're kind of very tactical on what does the product look like, what does the iteration of the customer base look like, what does the business model look like, and so forth. Then a lot of that is execution, and so you make those trade-offs for that path. You make other trade-offs for the academic path. Frequently it's like, well, actually, in fact, it's mostly you, or if you have a lab, it's the lab. Even in academia, you frequently have to, kind of work out like what is the funding for the position, et cetera. And so there's different trade-offs you make, and like which thing, like one of the ways to think about it, this is so important to me, I'm willing to make trade-offs for it, is kind of the first piece of it. And so for me, it was that impact and building things in the world were so important to me. I was willing to make some trade-offs on the other side in order to make that happen. Another one is the question of the way that we accomplish things of some note, I think, as human beings, is we either build or attach ourselves to platforms. The platform is the amplifier. Even when you say, well, I'm an idea generator, and I sit in this wonderful cubby in the Wolfson Library, and I generate some ideas and I write them down. Well, but writing them down and distributing them, they get distributed through the internet, they get distributed through books. Those are platforms. Oxford University, Wolfson Colleges, those are platforms. And so it's kind of like which platform, which amplification, which thing that, because platforms enable certain kinds of work in really good ways and make other kinds of work much more, difficult to do. So like, for example, when I build LinkedIn, kind of building my own platform, that's like LinkedIn is a really great tool for building out tools for helping people with their careers, finding other people in business to work with, co-founding and entrepreneurs, finding experts to consult with on a particular thing, crossing a border or crossing an industry. All of those things are really useful. But if we at LinkedIn started saying, hey, we've got LinkedIn milkshakes, you're like, no, that's not the platform for that. Or the LinkedIn clothing line, not the platform for that. And so platforms, and think in terms of platforms about what it is. And you either have to join a platform, possibly working your way up to some position of being able to leverage that platform, being a professor or lecturer, et cetera, or being an executive, or build a platform that's relevant. Now, building platforms is very hard. That tends to be the entrepreneurship thing, and so then patterns of entrepreneurship. And then the very last point I would say is the very first book I wrote was called The Startup of You, which was, I actually think even academics, now everyone needs to think about their career path as a kind of an entrepreneurial path. That doesn't mean that they need to create their own platforms, create a business, be a business entrepreneur. But because platforms are now much more unstable and flexible, and many people in their career jump between them in various ways, maybe academia is one of the platforms that, while still very difficult, is still mostly like it was before. But like that kind of approach is part of the reason I wrote that book, to say, here is an entrepreneurial mindset as applied to individuals thinking about their life and work path.
And I definitely remember when I was in my 20s where I was working, thinking, right, somebody else is going to be thinking about where I'm going to go next or what I'm going to do. And then realizing that actually nobody else was thinking about me. I mean, they were thinking about how to use me, but they weren't actually thinking about me and my interests. And I had to start being in charge of that as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's very helpful. So you then head back to the States, and for a while you work with somebody else's platform, so with Apple or Fujitsu or whatever, and then you decide, you're going to take the leap and actually do your own startup. And this is when socialnet.com comes in.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
This is Facebook before its time, but not just to rate girls, but to connect people with proper interest. Is that right?
Yeah. So, there were ideas in Facebook and Friendster before it, and MySpace before it, or MySpace before Facebook, and Friendster before MySpace, if anyone remember those two, that were not in SocialNet. So SocialNet had some ideas, which was, roughly speaking, when I was thinking about what kinds of products, so that I wasn't intrinsically, I must be an entrepreneur. I was like, I want to build products that combine this balance of very good for individuals and very good for the society, the tribe, the nation, the globe, humanity, and to kind of strike that balance well in ways that kind of helps both, and that's how we create progress as humanity. Individuals can live their lives better, and then they can live their lives better by collaborating and working with and working alongside and simply being part of the same society as other folks. And so when I looked at the internet, I said, well, this is a perfect platform for this, because you can, kind of, redefine identity, redefine human connection, redefine human tribe, redefine human communication, redefine human collaboration. And you can do this in various ways that makes a difference in our real lives. And so now the idea that I was still playing off of in SocialNet, that later with LinkedIn and others that I learned, which is I was doing pseudonyms, right? So it was like, oh, well, you can go and meet people first by pseudonym and then meet them in real life, have roommates, have tennis partners, have, dating partners, have work partners. That was part of thinking of the whole scope of this. That was SocialNet. And then it was like, no, actually, in fact, you need to have real identity, because real identity is where most of us really care about, is our real lives and so our real relationships. And so that needs to be the platform. And that's part of where, kind of LinkedIn came about, because it was this notion of, and this is still fundamentally kind of where I'm most at as a inventor and as a investor, is these human networks that redefine our societies. Now, sometimes it can get as deep as, well, okay, Joby and Uber meets Tesla in the air is kind of like, well, actually, in fact, a human transport grid going from 2D to 3D, redefining cities, redefining the human network of transport, redefining the human network of cities as a way of doing that, or autonomous vehicles in a kind of a similar way, which have very deep technology about them, but it's still the human network that is part of the thing that most often is the thing that I get involved with.
And I can see that the power of some of those ideas is that they are ideas as well as business propositions. And very often they will come with an optimistic hope that this will connect people better. But there is always the law of unintended consequences. And some of the people, I remember the guy in Facebook who created the sort of the thumbs up function, the like function, has thinks about it now as a terrible thing that has blighted the lives of teenagers. But the idea was quite a positive idea. So how do you balance the ideas, the concepts, with, if you're disrupting, there are going to be things that leads to that you can't predict?
Well, there's three things. So first is, I'm not sure that the like button is ultimately, on average, you would have wished it was never constructed. Like there's still lots of very good value that comes out of it. People say, oh, I loved seeing this essay, or this reminds me of my friend, Tim, and what he's doing, that kind of stuff. There's all of this very positive stuff that kind of goes into the water around us like fish and so on. So that's one. Now, that doesn't mean, let's get to the second point, which is, look, technology is dynamic. So we go, well, okay, we got these good things, but these are bad things, right? Like it causes too much popularity contest within, teenagers. It leads to, like, while we love the enablement of speech across all of society, you get a bunch of hate speech too. And we're like, well, that's less good for us. And by the way, because we all get agitated all the way back to television, like watching the burning building, or the reason why people are convinced that air travel is more dangerous than road travel, because they see the picture of the plane. It's news when the plane, has a problem. Whereas yet per mile, each mile you travel is much safer on planes than it is in cars, is because, we have that kind of nature. But it's like, look, technology is dynamic. And so the question is, look, not how do we roll back the clock, it's how do we roll forward the clock, and how do we shift this to make it happen? And so always being technological creators, like, okay, let's shift this, let's figure out what the issues are. And you can never shift them to perfect. Like anything that's at the scale of a country like the UK, anything at that scale has imperfections. Everything has that. And the question is the balance of more good than bad. Like, take the whole craziness around the AstraZeneca, like, oh my God, maybe there's a side effect. It's like, well, if you're more likely to get in a car accident going to the clinic to get the shot than you are to have the side effect from the shot, go get the shot.
Yeah,
right? Yeah. I mean, it's like, this is crazy. And so, people are bad about thinking about this kind of Bayesian reasoning and probability and all the rest. And it's one of the things I hope we get better at as humanity. But I think that the question is technology forward, invention, the creation of new, the future thing. And then the third thing is it's perfectly good to be critical of these things, critical of the technologies, critical of the large companies, because, by the way, that's part of how we evolve, and that's a good function to do. But to orient it towards what should we be doing better, right? And too often, I think what happens in this kind of dialogue is it's the way that I grandstand. I say, like, one of the funniest conversations I ever had with someone from Silicon Valley was, they said, well, what is Google giving me for my data? And I was like, well, free search. Right? Right.
Apart from that,
apart from that, it's like the life of Brian. Yeah. What have the Romans ever done for us? And you're like, okay, look, it doesn't mean that there aren't some real issues, and it's good to be critical on them and good to be focused, but don't forget, like it's not just throwing out. It's like throwing out, much worse than throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's like, no, look, we are building towards the future, and that's super important.
I'm just going to do a last bit on your career and then maybe a look at the future as well. So, LinkedIn, you mentioned, and it's just, I mean, you cover this in your book, Blitzscaling, but the way in which it grew so extraordinarily fast, and that is because you deliberately, at the right time, prioritized speed over efficiency, and you blew everyone else out of the water, and you just kept on doing it again and again with a different product. And it clearly is a great description of how LinkedIn worked, and it's a great description of how some of the other great tech titans made it. How broad an application is it? And I'm thinking in the context of a college, for example, I've got 700 students. If I said next year, I'm going to have 3,000 students, I'm not sure my environment could deal with that, but I'm not selling something in the same way. But how applicable is the idea of blitzscaling to a whole range of sectors and areas of life?
So I think blitzscaling, there's some requirements you need to have. So you need to have blitz capital in order for blitzscaling. So you need to have funds of that available. Most often those funds are only available in a commercial context. Now, occasionally, pandemic response, other kind of like, or emergency response or war, those are other places where you will also have the parallel of suddenly like a constraint of time and the importance of winning, and the willingness to inefficiently spend capital in order to get there. And the reason why that happens in a commercial circumstance is that on the models that are worthy of blitzscaling, ones that have network effects, ones that have a scale critical mass effect, where the getting to the first mover to scale is actually, in fact, the definer of the platform or the technology. All of those kinds of things lead you to blitzscaling, and that's worth that in a portfolio approach is worth applying the capital. Now, the question is, if you don't have either the end result or the competition or the capital, none of those cases you should really blitzscale. Now, then you say, well, is blitzscaling only Silicon Valley, only China as a friction? Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because actually, in fact, I think all companies are in the process of becoming technology companies. And blitzscaling, generally speaking, is the pattern by which technology companies play. Now, it may be that the steel plants are the slowest ones heading towards technology companies, and that the blitzscaling stuff matters less often, because you really do spend very inefficiently, both in financial capital and human capital and everything else, in order to realize that speed. And I guess I'd say as the last comment is part of when I do all of my books, Startup View, blitzscaling, I'm actually, in fact, trying to show an alternative lens to conventional wisdom. Because, typically, like when you go to, business schools, even Said focused on entrepreneurship and so forth. When you go to business schools, there tends to be a lot of teaching of efficiency. And actually, in fact, one of the things that I kind of learned was that what's efficiency to what? But efficiency to speed, not efficiency to capital spend, not efficiency to customer acquisition, not efficiency to human capital and hiring, but efficiency to speed is the thing that matters in certain kinds of these competitive business games. And that's one of the things that, when I look around the world, I see most intensely practiced in Silicon Valley and in China. And those are reasons why the tech ecosystems are coming out of these places. And so therefore is kind of an offering to the rest of the world to say, hey, we're better off the more areas of the world are creating good technological centers. And this is the way the game is played.
And there's a lovely bit in one of your books, where it is that talks about, when electronic bits are taking over from atoms, and sort
Yes.
of, the power of ideas is taking over from matter, and by definition, those things can move faster. And the other thing that strikes me just over the last year is, in some ways, it's felt as though we've all been paralyzed and not been able to do very much. So normal stuff has moved much more slowly. And yet it's been a moment where you can take decisions, the power of taking decisions very fast has really, if you don't take decisions fast, you get burnt for it. And if you
Yes.
do it politically as well as others, you get really praised for it. And going bold is what people want. And whether it be Joe Biden's trillion or whatever the sum is, or in the UK, Rishi Sunak's massive package, which people said that's massive. And then within a few months, people were saying, yeah, that was a very sensible thing to do. So just, these moments are really valuable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, decision making is one of the things where you have this extreme edge between academia and startups, because regular business is somewhere in the middle. Whereas when I was, a student, I was like, no, yes, you had time. You had, the exams were next time. The time of the tutor is at Y time. You did have some time things, but you were generally encouraged to put in as much time to kind of think through it. One of the things I learned from startup time was, when I'm in a meeting, I think, can I make this decision right now? Like, what's the cost of error? Like, if I can make the decision right now, because the cost of error is recoverable or anything else, make the decision now. Like, the good is the enemy of the perfect, and actually, make it go. And that was part of like smart responses to the pandemic, where we're on an exponential curve here that's going to get much worse. And yes, we're going to make some of these decisions poorly in the first month, but we got to make the decisions fast, because it's much worse to make the decisions slowly, because that'll end up with a worse space than just making them fast.
Can I, while we're on the subject, I'd be very interested in your take on the new Biden administration. I know you're a great supporter of the Democratic Party and have been a supporter of his as well. Mm. And he, sitting here anyway, feels like this curious combination of a classic American gentleman who a little bit slow and a little bit sort of genteel in his approach to things. He would fit in the 1960s just as well as he fits now. And yet some of the decisions he or his administration appear to be taking are really extremely bold, or seem from here to be very bold. So is he a really transformational, bold president, or is he returning us to a comfortable, conventional presidency?
Actually, in fact, I think he is exactly what you should have as a president, and in this way, the exact opposite of Trump, which is he's not focused on, look, he knows that it's important to have leadership, to have messaging and so forth, but as opposed to like governance is trying to occupy the entire news waves with saying whatever most outrageous thing today would inflame discord. It's the I want the communication to be as close to bridge building, collaboration, we are Americans together. Sometimes you can't do it, but I want the communication to be that. So I'm not trying to make the communication be the only thing that everyone should focus on, because I'm really focusing, I think the Biden administration is really focusing on the substance. It's like, look, we have to solve the pandemic stuff. We have to, get back to doing this the right way for the entire country and the world, no matter what the kind of political the political storm looks like and what pundits are saying on television doesn't matter. The substance is what matters. Then we have to care about what economic futures, like the pandemic has hit different segments of American society and the world society differently. And there are people who are really suffering from this, not just the people who've died, but lost jobs, and industries have gotten really collapsed. And look, we need to do something for them. And we're not going to announce it. We're just going to go do it. Right. And we'll have announcements as we go along to be the right part of leadership and when it helps with the work and so forth. But it's the work that matters, not the tweets. Right, in the extreme, kind of opposition to the former president.
Time's moving very fast, so I do want to give time for people to ask questions, and we've got a couple that have come in. So, but just sort of maybe a last few minutes around the future of work, where work is going, and whenever you have a crisis, everything stops. Everyone is going to build back better, and it's going to transform. It feels as though we are going to make a bit of a leap to the future, at least those of us lucky enough able to do so. But again, what would you see as the ways in which the world of work is going to be changing in 10 years' time? What will we look back on and say, why on earth are we still doing it that way?
Well, I think one of the good lessons generally and from entrepreneurship is whenever you hit a crisis, try to convert the crisis into opportunity. It's not always doable. It's not always the crisis you choose. But you say, okay, we've had a reset. Well, as opposed to trying to get back to where we were before, what's the thing that we should build now, given that the reset has been hit? Now, I do think that a lot of people obviously think, oh, I'm going to work from home, for the rest of my life now. I think a lot of that is going to revert back to offices. People are saying, well, we've all moved out of cities. The time of cities has passed. I think that's, absurd. I think there's reasons why human beings have clustered in cities. There's reasons why economic productivity and industry kind of focuses around cities. And I think that will come back as well, much, much faster than people think. And not because it's mandated, but because people go, I want to be in kind of those words from Hamilton, the musical, in the room where it happens. And so I think all of that's going to happen. Now, that being said, I think we're going to see now we've built a bunch more tools for enabling hey, maybe I will work from home for a week or for a day. I will take that time. Audio calls, switching to video calls, less travel. Like in business, frequently you would have traveled for that one meeting, right? Like I got this 1 hour meeting I need to do in London. I'll fly to London for it. Now maybe I'll try to build some other stuff around it. And I was like, no. Right. We can do that on, Zoom, Teams, Meet, etc. Like we can do it in this way. And so I think that I think those kinds of things will persist. And I think the tools that enable us to have more remote work contributing to what we're doing, I think will also be there and be persistent. I think there'll be a larger number of organizations that are purely distributed, but I don't think it'll go from the previous, call it 2% that were purely distributed to 25. I think it'll go from 2 to 4, which is still huge. It's doubles, but it's still not the norm.
And inequality, because I think that there is a view of the future that all of these brilliant things will be happening, but it will be happening for those people lucky enough to be on that train. And if you're not, life will actually be getting, if not worse, certainly diverging from those on the lucky train. Do you see that? Do you fear that?
Well, I think it's one of the problems with the natural flow of networks, because if you look at globalization as a densifying of networks, is you tend to get more stark between haves and have-nots as to who is better connected in the network, who is leveraged in the network, et cetera. And so part of what you try to do is you try to say, let's try to have as much opportunity to be connected into the network as possible. Let's try to make that work. It's everything from things we do at LinkedIn to try to make that happen, but also like a lot of my philanthropy is everything from enabling entrepreneurship with diversity and inclusion. There's a thing I'm doing here in the U.S. called Opportunity at Work, which is how do we get people of color communities and other kind of a minority, economically speaking, because women is like not a minority population, but a minority in terms of economic opportunity. And how do you get them better connected into the tech ecosystem, tech companies, founders and venture capital and all the rest of that? And how do you do all that? Because the network connectivity is the thing that creates that. And so if you do that, then you get to better outcomes for all of us. But you can't just presume that it's going to happen because networks do tend to homophily as a natural thing, and that's not good for us. And so anyway, so I think it's a good thing to stay focused on. But some people say you just have to break the network. And you're like, no. Actually, the networks are how everything works. You just need to have broader and more inclusive patterns into the network as a way of making it happen.
Reid, I think I might just go to some of the questions that are coming in. And again, if people are watching and they have questions, do put them in on the chat function. So we've got one first. So this is from B. Petronov. Hello, Reid, from a JRF who was at Wolfson when you were here. And he remembers conversations with you, and he chose, like you, not to continue in academia. So his question is, often we talk about technology as both having great benefits, but also generating severe threats to democracy or to the climate, etc. So what new ethical frameworks do we need to think of in order to boost the benefits and minimize the dangers of new technology?
Well, I think part of it on ethical framework, look, there's definitely ethical frameworks, but part of it is reconceptualizing how the virtues and what's essential. Like, so for example, one of the dialogues I think is really intense here in the US is freedom of speech is a very good value. We want freedom of speech. It's important in politics. It's important in truth discovery, etc. Well, where do you enable freedom of speech? Because the problem, of course, is you say, well, we just allow everyone to say what they want to say. Then you go, well, actually, in fact, if there's reasons for people to be promoting falseness, discord. So, for example, I actually think that one of the things that's happening within the US is that people are saying, oh, vaccine's bad and everything else to promote discord. Like literally the people who go, oh, that vaccine was invented by someone to control us and so on. And you're like, oh my gosh, like that's crazy, right? Like actually, in fact, vaccines have been well understood for a while. The reason why we got out of like these disastrous flu pandemics from 1918, which were, you can read books about, which absolutely terrifying to society, was because we started inventing vaccines, and vaccines are good. And there's a whole bunch of safety work that goes into them. And so you need to go, okay, so where does freedom of speech, where do you say, broadest possible aperture, but that doesn't mean necessarily say and promote everything. And then how do we have that regulated as a democracy? And what is the thing that we do? And say, well, we don't regulate any speech. Well, absolutely, we regulate speech. That's like truth in advertising. Every society in the planet, including the U.S., regulates truth in advertising. Well, that's truth in speech. Well, that's not the same as political speech. Okay, so you've already said now we're down to political speech. So is vaccine denialism, is that political speech? Well, I say it's political speech. Well, that means, well, I say that advertising my new snake oil drug, for curing everything and making you live longer, I say that's political speech. No, we don't want to say that. It's okay. So you can't just assert everything's political speech. So you need to do that. And that's the kind of thing that gets to redefining these ethical frameworks, which of course is challenging when society is in turmoil. And part of what's going on is people are yelling, you can't define speech at all. And yet the clear thing is we do regulate speech. We regulate speech on child porn. We regulate speech on terrorism. We regulate speech on planning hate activities, right? And it's just a question of where you draw the lines. Now, you want to not draw them too narrow. You don't want to have centralized Pravda truth in it. You want to have a breadth of it. That's part of being a healthy society. But those are the kinds of things that I think get into those ethical considerations. So it's not so much ethics and technology as we now have to more that too, but we have to refine our central concepts, which then plugs into it.
And is that fundamentally about politics? Because I can see it would be lovely if one imagined a wise government producing an ethical framework that everyone then followed, but it's actually rather different to that. It's creating a sense of norms within our societies, which people just buy into because that's who we are.
Yes, and sufficient people buy into. You always have that in a large enough population, you'll have people who think that, the government's being run by Martians, which, sometimes it seems so, but like, no, that's crazy, right? And so the question is to say, no, this is the baseline, right? And it isn't like, for example, I still think it's okay to have the person, literally the term soapbox, I think was from Hyde Park, where you put your soapbox out there and you could stand on, you could say, the Martians are running the parliament. You're allowed to do that. That's fine. Right?
You just don't get anyone listening to you, that's all.
Yes, right. Whereas maybe in media, including social media, including the internet, we have to be a little more cautious because it is media, because it can be hacked in ways, where you have things like in the U.S. context, Pizzagate. It's like, oh, there's a sex trafficking ring by Democrats being run out of this pizza parlor. You're like, really? Right? Like, do you I have a bridge I want to sell you.
And do you think that then, in 20 years' time, we'll look back to the kind of speech on social media at the moment and think that was a Wild West era? Why did we think we could get away with that? Or do you think the Wild West, do you think the social media is the Wild West?
So I'm always an optimist about how we can evolve to the future. So I think it will evolve to both some Wild West, but also some place. And by the way, journalism had the same thing. When journalism started, people, you have to go study the history of this, but people were funding this kind of muckraking and newsletters and didn't have anything with the truth. And it was like, well, let's evolve this system because we need to have some truth functions. And I would just hope that we'd be more intentional about it and more truth-seeking about it. That may be naive optimism, but that's the thing that I think that, we as leaders try to direct it to, given that there will be many antagonists who will go, I will tell you the truth. The truth is that, the election was stolen from Trump. And you're like, well, not by any credible observer. Zero. It's only people with the political interest who are asserting that. No academics, no think tanks, not even right-wing think tanks. It's only only the politics who are asserting it for their own belief. And that's, of course, kind of a crime as a leader of society.
Somebody's asked a question around sort of blitzscaling and vaccine rollout. And in a way, the curious thing that in the British context, which I guess I can talk about, is that it was a combination of some real entrepreneurial approaches to how to move things quickly, but linked with a national health service that meant that you could track and trace and deliver this equally to all sorts of people everywhere around the country.
Yes.
The US system is a bit more state-based, but it's done pretty well. But are there any sort of technology lessons or blitzscaling lessons you can learn from how to deal with the vaccine rollout, and particularly the challenges of the next 12 months about how to roll it out everywhere in the world?
Well, I think that one of the things that is important when you do blitzscaling is you realize it's not necessarily there's an expertise to it. It's not necessarily done casually. Part of the reason why you see so many major tech companies coming out of Silicon Valley and China is that there's a whole learning network, right? It's founders and executives and investors and everyone else who learn this stuff and learn what to do and what not to do. Because it isn't just like, oh, I hit the blitzscaling button and it works, right? It's like, no, you don't do any spend inefficiently. You're selective in how you do it. And I'd say that, it isn't just the commercial realm that gets it. One of the benefits of the commercial realm is we play the game like, it's the mythical 10,000 hours of practice, but we play it again and again and again and we learn, and that's actually helpful. I do think that, militaries learn this in various ways, although obviously when they get out of practice, they have the theoretical framework and, there's always some, breakage as it fixed out. And that's essentially the kind of thing I'd say is when you go into it, you have to think, does the leadership, like, let's make sure that the leadership knows what it's doing. Let's make sure that we know that there's going to be a bunch of failure. Like, there's no blitzscaling without lots of inefficiency, right? So it's like we have to plan and budget for it. Blitzscaling is not like, oh, now we go from 0 to 10,000 flawlessly, and it was just like a perfect game. It's like, no, there's going to be lots of cruft and breakage along the way, and that's what happens, and you have that expectation. And that's one of the reasons why it tends to happen more in the commercial space, because politics tends to be unforgiving, because your political opponents go, oh, look, you failed at this, you failed. And it's like, okay, well, in a blitzscaling circumstance, you're going to fail at some things as you're doing it, and that's what it is. Right. And so, I think that I think that that's the kind of thing that's challenging, but it is doable in national emergency circumstances. It is doable in these other circumstances. It just needs the political heft, or the organization, the backing of the capital. Because blitzscaling, you need serious backing in order to do, because you're doing a bunch of things that's going to cause some, hopefully only micro failures along the way, but that's what happens.
I guess that it's not dissimilar to the scientific method, is it? And I was talking to one of my students yesterday who had spent a week doing an experiment that had just failed. And she was feeling pretty miserable about it, but we concluded that actually she understood now that that was not an avenue to go down, which was great, because she's made progress, that there were other avenues she needed to look at. So,
yes, exactly. And like some of the canonical blitzscalers, in Silicon Valley had things that were failures, right? All of them. It's just that the successes so eclipse the failures. The people go, oh, that everything turns gold. I mean, like, Elon, amazing blitzscaler, but not everything works.
There's another one here, which is about, sort of goes to your point about what things we're not spotting. So in social sciences, they often talk about, if you asked a fish to describe its environment, the last thing it would describe is water, and yet it's the first thing you see from outside. And people talk about the social silences rather than social silences, things that we don't say. So I mean, are there things that, again, if you think we're looking back at the world we operate in at the moment, things that in the future will just seem blindingly obvious as central to who we were, but we just are not talking about them or perceiving them?
So I think the answer is absolutely yes. One of the projects that I've been meaning to do is kind of like, if you kind of look at kind of some epochs, depending on how fast human history is moving, there's always this lens back of X years. Maybe now it's like 20 to 50 years, depending, where you go, I can't believe those previous people, right? They thought X, right? So, so for example, if you took 2000 and 1950, it was like, what does interracial marriage look like? People in 2000 like, hey, that's just humanity. 1950 is like, oh, that's breaking society. And you're like, yeah, that's great progress in that time. Gay marriage, right? You go back, you go, oh my God, that's the corruption of society. Now it's like, hey, it's humanity, it's people, right? And that kind of thing. And by the way, the same thing is true in technology. Like, because when we experience new technology, it's like, oh my God, it's changing. And you're like, yeah. And by the way, now you go, well, whether it's, like, for example, the fact that this is getting the vaccines, the mRNA revolution is going to be a public health revolution that is amazing. And by the way, how does it come about? It comes about because of globalism. It comes about because of the invention and the exchange of ideas and technologies and all the rest. And this will create much longer, much healthier lives, not just around pandemics, but around other things. And I think that's the kind of thing that's super important. And so, that's yes. But one of the things I frequently say about the future is it's sooner and stranger than you think. And the stranger is a different vector. Like, sure, we're getting flying cars now. We thought we'd get flying cars in the 1950s, but we didn't know we'd get the internet. Right now, we're getting around to flying cars.
And there's that other great quote about the future, that the future is here. It's just here sort of in patches in various places.
Yes, that's the William Gibson. The future is already here, but unevenly distributed.
Unevenly distributed. Okay, and we're almost out of time, but one more question from Ludwig Drouin, who I seem to remember works in the French embassy in London at the moment. So he says, Reid, thanks for your insights and thanks for gifting the university with resources that enabled new initiatives. And two questions. Well, let's just go with one. What do you think about the financial transaction taxes versus the data transaction taxes systems? Which of those two is the right way forward, if either is right?
So I tend to think financial system taxes is better just because the data stuff is actually like, how do you value it the right way? Because like there's data that's extremely valuable in this context, this entity, and not at all valuable over here, right? And that's one of the things where all the discussion of the data stuff is challenging. And how do you govern the data the right way? Like the classic kind of, especially continental European way is say, well, you own your data. It's like, well, okay, so, you know, someone takes a picture of Tim and I having this conversation on Zoom. Who owns that? Who owns that? Is it the person who took the picture? Is it Wolfson College? Is it Tim? Is it me? It's much more complicated. And a lot of data is actually around use and the appropriate use of it. And that requires, speaking of the earlier question, new ethical framework, because not just the individual owns their data is like this framework that doesn't work in this kind of new university. And by the way, it really matters because you go, well, how are we going to invent the new applications? Like, how are we going to invent new health stuff? How are we going to make that happen? Well, actually, in fact, the appropriate, you know, kind of shared pots of data really matter to that. So this is a non-trivial question, even though people experience the newness of the technology and go, oh, like people say, like, oh, Google is doing something with your data and you don't know what it is. Oh, that feels fearful. They're giving you search and they're targeting some ads. Oh, that seems okay, right?
And
you know,
so yeah, I mean, but when you meet the leaders of these tech firms, I mean, are they people who are thinking a lot about ethical frameworks, or are they? I mean, they clearly need to make profits, and that's what they do very successfully. But are they thinking about ethical frameworks a lot?
I think they think about ethical frameworks some, but you do have natural blind spots because they may miss something, because obviously they're trying to build their companies, they're trying to make it happen, and it isn't just them, it's the product manager who is 4 levels down the organization who's trying to optimize a number and so forth. So that's part of the reason why I simultaneously say, look, the increased discussion around the ethics of this and what to do is really important. The criticism is really important. It isn't, don't be critical. But then the answer is the critics tend to go, and we should roll it back. We should stop it. And it's like, no. We should roll it forward. We should figure out how to shape it. So part of the intellectual obligations, not just on the critics, but everyone, is to think about, okay, that's a good point. What does the future look like because of that? Right? Is the framework that I try to advocate everybody think in terms.
And I mean, you know, I dare say that what you're describing is actually the application of your philosophical frame of mind to business questions.
Yes.
And you know, everything you say is about ideas, principles, and how they relate to successful business, which feels to me exactly as it should be.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I occasionally startle MBA classes by saying my philosophy background was more useful to me than an MBA would have been.
Reid, we've hit the hour. It's been absolutely a joy to talk to you. And here's looking for the restrictions of lockdown to lift. I hope you have a wonderful summer. And it's been a joy to talk to you. And if I can just look out at all of the people who've tuned in as well, it's been great to have you with us. I'm sorry I couldn't get through all of the questions, but thank you for your time. And thank you very much, Reid, for joining us. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.